Hi, this is Dale Duncan, creator of the S Cubed sight singing program for beginners, and you're listening to the Musicality Podcast.
Ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality Podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Hi, this is Christopher, founder of Musical U, and welcome to the Musicality Podcast. How do you feel about sight singing? To be handed a sheet of music and expected to sing it perfectly right off the bat? Or, stepping back, how do you feel about singing in general? Maybe even singing a familiar song sounds a bit intimidating to you. Today on the show, I'm joined by Dale Duncan, also known as Mr. D online, who is the creator of a popular method for teaching sight singing, specifically to grade school students, which is perhaps one of the most self-conscious groups of students you can imagine to try to get singing. I was desperate to pick Dale's brains on how exactly he approaches this, and how he's able to quickly get young people up to an impressive level of sight singing that has them winning competitions, and sight singing material that the vast majority of experienced adult singers would struggle with. In this conversation, we talk about how he helps students who struggle to sing in tune, and why he never requires members of his choir to sing solo. One core technique he uses to teach sight singing, and how it enables you to practice sight singing independent of score notation, and the clever way he helps students to integrate their pitch and rhythm skills when sight singing. Dale's S Cubed method for teaching sight singing is specifically designed to help other music teachers and choir directors like himself. But as you'll soon hear, Dale has a ton of insight that can be helpful to move anybody's singing or sight singing forwards. I hope you'll enjoy this. My name is Christopher Sutton, and this is the Musicality Podcast from Musical U. Welcome to the show, Dale. Thank you for joining us today.
It's awesome to be here. Thanks for having me.
So these days, you are a world-leading specialist in sight singing, and particularly in the middle school environment. And I'd love to understand if this is something you were skillful in from the very beginning, or if not, what did your own musical journey look like? What were your early music education experiences?
I started playing piano when I was 5, and I had a teacher that I did not like. She was, I don't think she was able to work with young children. And I stayed for about a year, and then I stopped till I was maybe 11. And then I took for a couple of more years, but I didn't practice very much. So I love to sing more than I love to play. And when I decided to focus more on singing at around age 11, I became less interested in piano and just did more performing things with my singing. I did an opera as a little boy. I sang in boys' choir. And then when my voice changed, I did productions in junior high school and high school. And performance really was where my passion was. And I think when I stopped taking piano, I kind of lost some of the abilities I might have obtained with sight singing. And when I was in high school, I really didn't know how to figure out the notes at all. Like, I just kind of sang and listened and estimated. I didn't know what I was doing. And then when I went to college, I encountered the same situation. I went to music school at the University of North Carolina. And when I was there, we had to have sight singing in our freshman year. I decided to pass. I would record every example, and this was a long time ago. So I recorded it. I put it on like a Walkman, and I would put it on my head and walk across campus and listen to the examples. We would have to sit down next to the teacher, and the teacher would have us sing the examples, and I would study the examples when I would be sitting and listen to the examples when I'd be walking, and then I would be able to identify what they were. So I sat down next to him, and each time I would get a great grade because I just listened. I wasn't sight singing though. So then I started teaching, which was a nightmare. And the kids, I had to impart this tool of sight singing on them, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I remember they would get the books out. They were trying their best for me, but when they would start to sing it. They'd get to like measure 2, and then everyone would just drop out. And they, whenever I would ask them to take out the sight singing books, they would just moan, and that was just not a good situation. So that is sort of what led me to start working on how to teach this subject better to the true beginner.
That's really interesting. From my own experience, I grew up doing a lot of singing, and particularly in a choir context. And looking back, I was never really taught to sight sing. When I was doing oral skills prep for instrument exams, there would be these little bits where you have to sight sing 2 bars, and I'd get a 15-minute teaching session where they tried to explain intervals to me and give me a reference song for the intervals, and they were just like, and then sing the example. And I was like, what? How does this all fit together? And that was how it was for me for about 10 years. And some people in choir could figure it out, and then I just listened to what they did and replicated it. But looking back, it's bizarre that we were handed this sheet music in choir, expected to sight sing it, and then in reality, most people just kind of picked it up by ear. And right. I'm sure some of our listeners are surprised to hear that someone like yourself who went to college for music, it sounds like you also weren't really taught step by step how to do sight singing.
No, when they would say go up a half step, really, literally until my junior year, I was guessing. I had no idea what I was doing. And I just didn't have the skill sets. And the skill sets required to be able to sight sing are just tremendous. The brain, I would love to see a study done of the brain, a scientist, looking at the brain as it's sight singing, as it's trying to learn these skill sets, because there are so many things involved, as I'm sure there are with instruments. But with an instrument, you're touching something, with a piano, you're touching, and your body is doing something. With all the other instruments, which I'm not familiar with, I didn't play any other thing, but I know that there's touching. There's with French horn, I think that's such a hard instrument, right? But I don't really even know how they get the pitch because I've never played one, but I know that every French horn player I know has such a great ear, So there are so many things involved that with singing, in singing classes throughout my life, we never did anything. We never used the Kodai hand signs. We never, nobody ever taught me the skill sets required. And so what I've tried to do over my career with my students is to break it down step by step and to give them the skill sets one step at a time and let them master it. I'm a former gymnast, so for me, I think about teaching sight singing the way we teach gymnastics, which you don't progress from level 1 to level 2 until you've mastered the skills in level 1. And when you go too fast, if you skip a step, you never ever will be a very good gymnast. Even if you topped out at level 6, if you've skipped steps, you're just not going to be that good. So that kind of has influenced my approach of the step-by-step and being able to instill it successfully. And most importantly, to be able to do it in a fun way that's engaging, because I teach, 11 to 14-year-olds. And if it's miserable, if they're moaning when they pull out a book, which, is just a miserable experience, they're really, even if they are successfully taught it, it's not a great journey. And I want that for them.
Well, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are feeling the way I would have if you had said to me at the age of 16, I can teach you sight singing step by step, which is super excited and curious to know how that can work. Because to me, it was definitely a magical kind of skill. But before we dig into all that goodness, I want to just come back for a moment to something you talked about there, which was when you left college and you'd had this experience of sight singing where you kind of, used your ear to get through the requirements, but you didn't really go through the process of learning sight singing, and then you were cast into this teaching environment where suddenly you were in the teacher's position. Take us back to that and those, maybe the first year of teaching. What was that like for you? Was it just the sight singing that was tricky, or what was it like becoming a music teacher?
It was an absolute nightmare, I would say, for really 3 years. I had sung on a cruise ship between finishing my master's in Hawaii, of all places, right? A beautiful place, before I began teaching, but I knew I would teach. And so I questioned myself so many times. I'm like, that cruise ship in Hawaii, why am I not on that cruise ship? It was so bad. The classroom management piece was really hard. I looked about 12 years old, and the students were 12. So, that was a really tricky thing. I tried to be mean instead of really just relating to the kids. I wasn't being myself, is the bottom line. And then with the sight singing, I was determined I wanted to make them literate. I wanted to take them to adjudication, the state adjudication, because it gave me a goal. It helped me prepare them for something. And each time I worked on it, I couldn't figure out like how to get them to be able to combine pitch and rhythm at the same time. The first time they would encounter a half note, they would not hold it long enough. And then some child would move on to the next pitch before time. And then, of course, this age group is not very confident, usually. I never have taught a Mozart. So I don't know where those come from. I've been waiting for 27 years. I have not had one yet. But every time my students would encounter that difficulty, they're just embarrassed to be wrong. And so I was encountering that over and over and over again. And the first year I didn't take them to adjudication because I couldn't get them ready enough. The second year I took them to adjudication and they sang 2 songs for, a rating of superior, excellent, good, fair, blah, blah, blah. And then they went into the sight singing room and they did the same. Now, by the second year, in that state, they only had to do stepwise quarter notes, unison. It was very simple. They did get through that very well, which was awesome. And I was grateful. So I was starting even then to figure out how to get some of this across, even though now my students can go 3 parts and do skips as wide as an octave and chromatics and things that are crazy. That never could have happened back then. But I was starting to figure it out. I just didn't really realize it. They got a superior in sight singing. But when they were in there with the judges singing their songs, they had always gotten superiors before me. The teacher always received superiors. They got a 3, which is, I was devastated. We got on the bus and the students looked at me and they were trying to make me feel better. And they were like, Mr. Duncan, and they were trying to use some slang. They said, we did good. And then we all laughed. It was right. It was fine. And then after that, the state I was teaching in North Carolina, they had a magazine for choral teachers. They had always published the superior ratings. That year, they accidentally published all of the ratings. So all of my peers that I had gone to school with, everyone saw that my students had received 3s. That was really humiliating. And I almost stopped teaching. I was really ready. I at the end of that year, said to myself, I either have to stop doing this because I'm not good at it, or I've got to figure it out. And then in year 4, I really made an aggressive attempt to get it all figured out. And I just, I had already been trying, but I was really on the brink of leaving.
Wow. And in a moment, I want to dive into that 4th year and how things started to come together for you. But before we go into the super interesting topic of sight singing, which I think for a lot of people seems like quite an advanced skill in the world of singing, let's just talk a minute about singing in general, because you were there cast in with 11 to 14-year-olds, and that's an age where confidence is just starting to form and, personal identity is coming into its own. And I know for a lot of our listeners who are adults, singing is intimidating. I imagine it's 10 times so for the kid in the classroom who's not sure they're a good singer. How did you approach that, or what were your experiences in those first few years of children just not wanting to sing or feeling like they can't sing, or indeed not being able to sing in tune?
Yeah, singing is such a personal thing because it comes out of your body. I mean, I think I just said this to some of my students last week. Like, it's not the same as sitting at a piano or picking up an instrument. You can hide behind that a little bit. And with singing, it's so personal. It's so intimate. And I absolutely never make my students sing by themselves unless they want. And I make sure they know that from the beginning, because they're terrified of that. A lot of teachers question the fact that I don't voice test. I never voice test. Like I would never want them to have to. I did in the early years, and I regretted it because I'd watch their faces. They were just so scared. I didn't want to put them through that unless they wanted to go through that, right? Like if we're auditioning for a solo and they're trying to face that fear, or if they're auditioning for a musical that we're doing or something, that's a whole different thing. That's a whole different child. And I want my room to be a place where those children can be, and also the children who really have no interest in singing alone, because it is just scary. So these students in my room know that I'm never going to make them do that. And if they want to do it, they can. And in my home, I have a karaoke machine. And I love having karaoke parties, right? And it's so much fun. And I love it. I love hearing people who are, and coaxing people who are not really comfortable singing to singing. Now, may or may not be some alcohol involved when that occurs, but we definitely get them a little bit, more comfortable. And then when they sing, it's just so sweet to me. And so often they think they can't do that. And when they do, they're so freed. It's awesome. And these are, of course, friends. So I understand that fear. But the importance of singing for any instrumentalist, I think, is critical because it helps you sing. It helps you learn to play. It helps you learn to play in tune more, I think. I think if you can figure out what the part is on the paper before you're trying to play it, I think that can only be a good thing. Now, I am not an instrumentalist outside the piano, and I'm not even that good at the piano. So I'm not the expert on that subject, but I know how much is required in the brain to get people to even sing anything in tune, or to sight sing especially, to pick notes off the page and in that moment be able to sing it. So many things are happening. So I think adults are like little middle school kids. The ones who never sang are still afraid to sing. You think about your life, how many things happen in middle school that you think about still when you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s. That was an awful time for so many. I understand that fear just sits just like you're in sixth grade, scared to sing.
Absolutely. And I love that you do not force the kids to come sing solo at the front of the room. It's something that's come up a few times in the show when talking about people thinking they can't sing, because that is so often people's first experience of learning whether or not they can sing. They're put at the front, teacher plays a note on the piano. If you hit it, great, you're in choir. If you don't, you can't sing. And for the rest of your life, you think you can't sing. And I wish...
And then you don't.
Exactly, you don't even try. And I just wish more choir directors would make it clear to people considering joining their choir that that is how they approach things, that they are not going to be put on the spot like that. Because I know so many instrument players who like the idea of going along even to their church choir or just the local community choir and giving it a go, but they won't because they're nervous that the first time they'll be put in front of the piano, they won't get the note right and it'll be really embarrassing. And that's hard as an adult. It's hard as a child.
I don't want my students to have that imprint on them, from me ever. I think that my room should be a place where anybody who wants to sing can do it. I don't screen my 6th and 7th graders ever. And in 8th grade, I can only have 84 students in a class. And so the way my schedule is set up, I do have to screen some of those and I don't ever audition them. I have a program called Music Prodigy that my students use, and they sing into it. I can listen to them sing. And I can see the grade. There's a grade that comes up for them. It's a sight singing program. And I use that as a part of the screening process. And it takes some pressure off. If by the time they're in 8th grade, they haven't gotten certain skill sets, then I can, but even I make exceptions even for that, for the students who just really want to sing desperately. I try to find a space for them in that room because not that I have any judgment on people who do screen the kids if that's the program they've set up, but I think even in those programs there should be places where students can sing who are not screened if they want to sing. In my high school, we had it felt like we had this top choir, which I was lucky enough to be in. I think as a male, it's a little easier to get in that, even when you can't sight sing. And then we had the other choirs, and it felt like they weren't as good, they weren't as valued, and for me, that was not how I wanted mine to be.
Gotcha. So one thing I love about you and the material you publish online in your blog and your videos is that you're clearly someone who does have this very inclusive, encouraging, joyful spirit to your teaching, but you balance that with some very serious teaching. You are not just creating a fun music play environment, you are imparting real skills. And so I think I have to ask the follow-up question of, if you're not putting them on the spot and checking before they join the choir that they can sing in tune, what do you do when you're, aspiring to take them to competition and you can hear as the choir director that there are 2 or 3 in the room who are just not hitting the pitches? How do you handle that?
Well, first of all, I do a lot of listening every single day. And my ear has become so good at spotting where the children are who are having the issues. I move around the room when I hear that happening, if I need to, because I have very large classroom. Let's say I have a child, a boy, this is typical of middle school, whose voice has changed very quickly, who's dropping the octave. He's matching pitch, but it's on the octave. That child, what I would do with him is at the end of class, I would ask him, without anyone hearing, or maybe just only the person next to him, because I don't want to put him on the spot. Could you come see me during homeroom, or whenever I have time? And I'd write him a pass. He'd come to me. I would find where his voice is living. And usually I use a minor third, sol, mi, sol, or whatever. And it's usually way down deep where they are. So I go to where they are and I find it and I help them feel what it's like to match the pitch, because it's such a physical sensation when they do it. And then they hear it as well instantly. Because if you let them not match pitch for a really long time, then physically they become numb to it. And it becomes really difficult to fix. I compare it to walking with a hunchback when you're a young kid, and people say straighten up. Your body, your muscles go and they remember that position. And then it becomes very hard to correct. And then suddenly you turn 60 and you've got this, happening or whatever. I also compare it to the lines on our faces. It's like if you've been frowning your entire life, you're going to have the frown marks. If you've been smiling, you're going to have the smile marks, So these are the things I think, the muscle memory, the physicality. And I try to get them to find it. I take them up by half steps until they stop feeling that they're in tune and hearing, and I have them recognize it. And when they recognize it, then we're on our way. And this is not a one-time fix. I might have to have that child back several times. I teach them to listen. In class, I use tons of ear training things that are on my YouTube channel. I have, I think it's called Follow the Dot. Or I think you may even know better than me. But there are things that they have to do. I sing out of tune on purpose. I play a key on the piano. I sing a little sharp. And then I tell them I'm sharp, and then I ask them afterwards if they can hear when I'm out of tune, something that simple. And then I'll say, well, I went sharp again. Like I'll start in tune and then I'll go sharp. And I'm just training their ears slowly. There is nothing quick about learning to sing in tune. There's nothing quick about learning to sight sing. For some kids, it's easier than others. There are some students who have more natural ability in those areas than others, but I believe that every child can get there, if we take the time, with them. And if our teaching techniques are strong in the classroom, we can keep the individual work to a minimum. It saves us a lot of time. So that's what I've tried to do, is become more efficient and more effective in identifying and addressing early.
Fantastic. I think we'll definitely put a link in the show notes to one of your videos that I enjoyed on this topic, which was where you had a bullseye diagram on the board, and you, as you said, would play a note on the piano, and then you would match pitch and then move gradually up or gradually down, and the students had to indicate when they heard that you'd gone off pitch, which I thought was really elegant as a way to separate out that ear skill from the vocal control you need to match pitch yourself.
And the best thing is they laugh about it. Like they look, their faces get all twisted because they can't, I'm so out of tune, and then I have fun with it, and then they laugh, and then I end up laughing. And then anyway, it's just, that's the way it has to be. I love that. And sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask if there are any other exercises or ideas you found useful. If someone's in the situation of trying to teach this to themselves or trying to learn it in the privacy of their own home, are there any things like that they can do to help tune their ear and their voice in to matching pitch? I would just, again, refer to those YouTube videos. I made several about singing in tune and Bullseye and ear training. If they go to that YouTube channel and type in ear training, these are meant for middle school, but these people, anyone, any age can learn and listen and hear. And I think when you start to hear what flat is, through those videos, and then you record yourself. I think recording yourself is going to be really important to identify, learning. Once your ear sharpens a little bit, you record yourself.
You play it back. There's so many easy ways to do that. And then you listen very carefully and non-judgmentally. And you say, oh, okay, maybe I was out of tune there. And if that's all you can identify is that you were out of tune, then you're still on your way, right? But you need to learn whether you're flat or sharp and what your tendencies are, you will over time if you listen to yourself, because you'll have habits. For you, maybe your tendency is when you go into the higher range of your voice that you tend to go sharp or whatever. You learn to identify those tendencies, and then you can slowly begin to address them more and more over time on your own with your own recordings.
Fantastic. And you referred earlier to the program, the app that you use with your students, Music Prodigy. And I believe, that doesn't just let you listen to their recordings. It also gives them feedback on their singing pitch. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, oh, it's so good. It's like they listen. Well, they sing first, and then they, as they're singing, they get a red dot if they're wrong, a yellow if they're close, and a green if they're right. And that includes pitch and rhythm. And of course, the exercises that I use with Music Prodigy are the ones I created to complement S Cubed. They're available for anyone who wants to do it. It would be a good ear training thing for people. It's on the Music Prodigy website, but the examples are really, really simple, and they're in the beginning, and then they get harder and harder as time goes. But in the start, they're just singing quarter notes, and they're basically seeing if they're singing in tune. And then later on, I incorporate the rhythm and other things and skips and such as that, so they can see if they can improve with time.
Terrific. Well, I think it comes back to what you were saying before about needing to make it step by step. And that's certainly what we found at Musical You. A lot of the people who come to us wanting help with singing, what they've experienced is that learning to sing is, here is a song, try and sing it. Oh, you didn't sing it right. Never mind. And what we try and do is break it down for them into, let's first make sure you can sing one note in tune, and then we can worry about singing another note after that, and vocal control and so on. And then we can work our way to songs and repertoire. And we've just found that's really liberating for people, because they're still working towards the songs they want to sing confidently and accurately, but they don't have to tackle that all at once, and they can master the building blocks first.
Yes, it's definitely the best way. You are less frustrated. You can enjoy the process more. You think about any song, any given song, and how many pitches there are and different rhythms, and how can you expect, if you're learning, to be able to hit every single one of those pitches in tune, right off, like in a live performance? And how many live performers have we heard who are famous, who sing terribly out of tune when they're in a concert venue filled with millions of people, or thousands of people? It's just, we are human, but we try to perfect slowly over time and get our brain to awaken to what we need to do to sing in tune, or to sight sing, or whatever it is we're trying to do.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, because I think it's easy to fall into the trap of assuming it's kind of an on-off switch. Either you can sing or you can't. And I was just thinking about this week. I was singing a Beatles song to get my 7-month-old to sleep. And I was in a room where there was quite a lot of echo, and so it was really easy for me to hear my own singing. And I was very aware that, my pitching is not great these days. My voice is rusty. I will be a little sharp or a little flat, and I can hear that, and I can correct it. And when I'm paying attention, I do fine. But it just brought home to me, this is not a one and done kind of thing. Your voice is such a biological instrument. You really do need to make sure your ears are staying turned on to get that vocal control right.
One of the things I say to the students often, especially early in the year, is to self-assess and self-correct as they're singing. And that is something that definitely clicks with even that age group, and maybe it will click with some of your listeners. Singing is something active, and I can see, and say this to my students, I can see when you're listening. I don't know how, maybe it's all these years of being in the classroom, and I can see children who are just singing. And not that there's anything wrong with that. Like, I want them to enjoy it. I want their faces to be alive. But you have to be able to do all of those things, and it takes time to be able to do that. So with my sixth graders who are new to me, the 11 and 12-year-olds, I in the first 9 weeks, the first semester really, I am teaching them how to learn to self-assess and self-correct instantly. And when they do, I reward it, and I say, I know that you're doing that. Like, it's happening right now. Like, and then they know that I'm noticing, and not beating them down, So I try to keep it as positive as I can. And that's what we have to do with ourselves as individuals if we're self-teaching,
Absolutely. So let's talk about sight singing in particular then. So by that we mean being presented with a piece of sheet music and then trying to produce it with your voice. And you do this in the choir context, and you alluded there to competitions. Can you talk a little bit about what sight singing is to you as a high school music teacher, singing teacher, and what those competitions look like? Because it's something that I have to admit I hadn't really come across as someone who grew up in the UK and wasn't immersed in that world of competitive choirs. It's really interesting.
Well, in the state of Georgia, where I live, in the middle, when I moved here from New Jersey. So North Carolina had a unison requirement, unison stepwise. That was it for this age group. New Jersey had no requirement. Georgia has 3 parts for 8th grade, 3 parts, skips as wide as an octave, with dotted quarter 8th combinations, syncopations, crazy stuff. I was so alarmed when I read what they required, and I thought it couldn't possibly be true, that I called a colleague who'd been helping me, and this was 2002, and I was like, she said, yes, that's what it is. That's what they have to do when you go. And I want to go to these things because they are really helpful for me. I get feedback from the judges about the 2 songs they sing, and it helps me dot my I's and cross my T's as I'm teaching the sight singing. I want to make sure I get it, get the skill sets in them so they can beat the page, So in the first year I went to it, and they sat down and they did the very best that they could do. And it was not good. They failed. They got like a 3 out of 1 is best, 5 is worst. The kids were disappointed. I was disappointed, but fortunately I had this wonderful sight singing judge, and she came out and she gave the kids and me some tips that were really helpful. And so I went home that summer and I just started thinking about those tips and how I could incorporate some of those things for the coming year. Because when people ask me about sight singing, that's when I really started developing S Cube. That's when it really got I'm sure I started before that, but I started to really put the puzzle pieces together because I was determined to go and beat that page the next year, with the kids. And the outcome of getting to that, for me to get to that outcome had way more positive impact than I ever could have anticipated. For my students, they have to sing a cappella. They have 5 minutes to figure out what the example is. I can't sing with them. I can't help them. I can only give them do and maybe a scale. They can sing a scale and an arpeggio. That's all they can do. And so all I can do, and I can guide them and say, look at measure 3 or look at measure 5. But these students had to be able to beat that page. And so the second year, I had gotten the skill sets in them enough that they were successful, and it was a great feeling. But I watched so many teachers and their students walk out of the room completely demoralized that I was like, I've got to figure out ways to share it. Back then there was no YouTube, there was no Google. I didn't have any idea how to share. So around 2009, I was living in Switzerland for a year with gymnastics stuff. And I was thinking about sight singing and how I could share it. So I started writing a book and I submitted it to music publishers. Nothing. Not interested. It's boring. It really was. It didn't translate this way. More years go by. And then in 2013, I found Teachers Pay Teachers, which I was like, I didn't know a thing about it, but I knew that I could offer it digitally. I could create PowerPoints. I could record myself singing. I could record the students learning, there was nothing like that out there. And so I did it, and it was terrible. My PowerPoints are still awful, but the YouTube links are all out there. Most of them are public. Your listeners can listen to them and see what they can learn that will help them. But mostly, I'm just really glad I'm helping teachers, who need help with the subject matter, and I'm taking them step by step through the process. If they just follow it and turn the page, or click the link or whatever they have to do to the next thing. They can figure it out with their students, but it's not a quick fix. There's no such thing, really. Sorry, I wish I had better. It's just how it is. It takes time to build skills.
We refer sometimes on this show to the advantages you have as an adult learner, and I think one of those is definitely a realistic sense of what's possible. And so I know a lot of our listeners won't be put off by the fact that this isn't an overnight trick to sight singing. You know, it is going to take practice. But on that front, I think what you just described is fascinating, and I think it's super cool that those competitions exist and stretch high school, middle school choirs in that way, because that's not something I've come across. And clearly it results in students who are equipped with an amazing level of sight singing that will serve them in all of their musical life. But I mentioned there, you know, the practice and repetition that's going to be involved to learn a skill over time. When I was faced with sight singing, that was essentially all that was presented to me. You know, try it again. Oh, you got it wrong. Try it again. And, you know,
yes.
That's incredibly frustrating. And clearly you've developed a step-by-step process. And I wonder if we could just give our listeners a glimpse into what that might look like. What are the tools you're drawing on, or the ideas or the frameworks that mean, because, you know, you alluded to the simplicity of stepwise quarter note sight singing examples. Yeah. I know for 99% of musicians, that is impossible. Like, genuinely, literally 99% of good instrument players would not be able to accurately sing stepwise quarter notes. And by stepwise, we just mean it's moving up and down the scale without any jumps. And that's no criticism of them. As we've alluded to, this isn't something that's taught. But once you learn these skills, that does seem like a very simple example. So can you just give a bit of a glimpse into what this process looks like and what it is that enables your middle schoolers to do this amazing sight singing?
At first, I think the important thing is the Kodai hand signs. You know, I play a game with the students where I introduce it. It's fun for them. I teach them the importance of going up and down. I teach them the importance of the half steps and things like that over time, you know, over the first couple of weeks. Within 2 or 3 weeks of doing this game called Forbidden Pattern, they're then able to I point to an example on the page, very simple stepwise. And actually, before I do that, I have them do something called follow the hand. And I will just use the hand signs. I'll give them do, and they follow the hand. And they're essentially already reading music, you know, you can say, because they're following my hand, you know. And then the next step is I go to the board and I point to the example and I tell them this is do, and then I point to it, and, you know, if I ask them if it's on the space or on the line, because, you know, the visual impact, there's not only an ear training component, there's a visual component. I mean, many people, I didn't realize for many years that some students don't understand the D below on the treble clef below the staff, that it's a space note. I didn't realize that. Like they thought it was the E, you know, or whatever. And when I realized that, I knew then that I had to then give my students visual training, you know, and how to see what a ledger line is. What does the note look like when it's below the ledger line? I didn't realize how much my students were tricked up by when a note is a quarter note versus a half note, because it's white versus black. I mean, there's so many things with the young beginner that I didn't know. So I was taking them through those steps. I train their ears, I train their eyes, and then we're building the skill sets to rhythm. That would be the next step. We're just adding one layer at a time. But that's how we get to, you know, when they are doing rhythm, I have them pulse. You know, that's something I didn't do for a long time. You know, pulsing, I tell them that by the time they get to the pulsing, it's like they're tapping their head and rubbing their bellies at the same time and tap dancing. You know, they're doing so many things and they don't realize it. And for them, by the time we've built slowly to that point where they can actually maybe sing a unison, it probably takes maybe 8 weeks for them to sing unison with maybe half notes and whole notes. And we do it 10 to 15 minutes a day, 3 to 4 times a week. So it's not like it takes that much time, but it's really just being committed to that process, one step at a time. But I say to them, I like do a cartwheel or something in the room, because I'm like, you know, this is awesome that you are able to do this. And for them, they're like, well, he's excited, you know, but like for them, really at that point feel like that much, but they're still appreciating that it is a big deal, you know, but we don't want it to feel like a big deal. It's like learning any language, you know, If you go to France and you don't speak French, and you have a translator with you all of the time, you will never learn the language. Yeah, and so if you don't actually try to speak it, and you're listening and you're looking at the physical cues that people are doing and all the things that are required when you're learning a language, it's not just oral, it's not just visual, and it's not just kinesthetic. It's all of it. You have to leverage all learning styles, and that's what I've tried to do as I've used my program with my students.
Gotcha. Well, I want to pick up on that point about speaking a language in a moment. But first, I think I need to hit pause because you mentioned a lot of really good stuff there that to me or you is clear, but to our listener may be a bit less familiar. And so specifically Kodai hand signs, it's a bit tricky for us to convey on an audio podcast. But
Yes.
if you wouldn't mind just explaining what is that, how does it work, and why is it helpful for sight singing?
Okay, the Kodai hand signs were created by a Hungarian man. His last name was Kodai, and it's used in his system, which I'm not an expert on by any means. I've taken level 1 many, many years ago, but it's a good system for younger singers, really young, like ages 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Some teachers use it beyond, and they're really good at it. My system is based on those hand signs on some level. You lift your hand up, you lower your hand, you show the skips with your hand. There are certain specific hand gestures for sol versus mi versus fa, that sort of thing. So those are the hand signs we play the game with. And the students are also uncomfortable with those in the beginning if they've never been exposed. And I encourage them to use them even if they're making mistakes. It's really about the doing, and not worrying if you're making the errors at this moment.
Cool. And so this is something where you have a particular hand sign for each note of the scale. And we're talking about
Right.
movable do, sulfur. So it's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, whatever key
Right.
you're in.
Yes, I use movable do, but in the beginning, I used a concept called varied but comfortable do because and I use like C, C sharp, D, D sharp, and E around there because middle school students are afraid to sing high, and they get paranoid, and then that becomes the focus. If we go to the key of G and we ask them to sight sing, they're like, oh, very timid, they're scared. So I figured in the beginning I would stick them around there without any regard for going from the key of C to the key of G to the key of F, which is what most sight singing methods do. And for middle school, this age group, it just seemed to be an obstacle. So I just removed the obstacle. Now, over time, by about the 14th or 15th week, then they get into movable do, and we stick to what's really on the page because they're able and they're ready. We have to get out of that very big comfortable do because they really do get stuck and they can't sing in the correct keys if we don't do that.
Gotcha. I love that. And it lets them get a real physical, visceral sense for those hand signs and pitches and how they sound before you worry about connecting it with the nitty gritty of notation and the stuff. Right?
Oh, yeah. Yes. And I actually, not until really year 3 do I talk that much about theory. It's I teach my students my S cubed for 3 years. The first 2 years I repeat because I get a lot of new students. And then the final year we go into all kinds of things, but they're still not getting there. They don't leave me as theory experts. They leave me as competent, it's like they could, let's go back to French. It's like they can speak French completely fluently. Give them anything, they can do just about anything. They have no what they're doing, but they're ready for the high school teacher to go into all of the things that I didn't touch on because it really gets in the way on some level. It's like we don't expect, a baby to come out and conjugate a sentence, they have to speak and they have to learn the cues. It's just the same.
Perfect. Well, I'll make sure we have a link in the show notes to one of your videos where people can see this in action with some of your middle schoolers as a choir singing and hand signing their way through a sight singing example. The other specific thing I wanted to pick up on there was you mentioned pulsing, which I think is a really interesting idea that people may not be familiar with. Could you explain what that is and how it helps?
Well, when we get into keeping the steady beat, which is a skill in its own, it's not an easy skill, and especially for these young kids. the students are taught by me to constantly, their hand goes forward with each beat as they're, I'll count them in. I'll go 1, 1, 2, ready, go. And then they'll just pulse to that beat with the solfege signs. And they are lifting and lowering their hands at the same time, which is really, really hard to do. So I go carefully and slowly, and I hold them through that process until they master that skill. And they keep it. And if it's nothing, within a month or so, it's like second nature.
Very cool. Well, again, you can see this in action in the videos, but just to give you a sense, it's like watching someone hammer with an imaginary hammer with a steady beat, or a very restrained version of a Metallica crowd pumping their fists in the air as the song plays.
That's the best way to put it.
So I just wanted to get a glimpse into this for the people listening, because I think it conveys clearly how there are very practical tools that you're using here in the S-cubed method in your own teaching. This isn't something where you study theory carefully and then you intellectually know how to do it. And it's not something where you just need to be born with an instinct to do it. This is kinesthetic, visual, auditory, all combined together in a step-by-step fashion that helps you really internalize what the notes on the page should sound like. You mentioned there the analogy to language and how your students get very good at speaking the language. And one blog post I loved on your site was about what you call chaos and how it compares with the activity of audiation. And we've talked on the show before about the advantages of audiation, imagining music in your head. And I was delighted to see how you use this idea of chaos in preparing for sight singing. I wonder, could you first just talk us through, you mentioned your students have 5 minutes before a sight singing performance, as it were, a sight singing test. How do they use that 5 minutes, and how does that connect to this idea of chaos?
Well, chaos, any middle school teacher knows what that is already. But anyway, just kidding. Chaos is like it's a time when they get to personally practice. I teach chaos to them. This is how it goes. These are the rules. This is what you do. They sing out loud on their own. They have to block everyone out in the room because it sounds like an orchestra tuning up. And this I found to be a useful technique because it gives them their own personal time, which everybody can work at their own level. I encourage them that if they only get through measure 1, but they're successful, that's okay. And if they have the person next to them who gets all the way through it 5 times during the minute of practice that I give them or whatever, that's okay too, and not even to worry about it. I want them to work at their own pace, their own level. I found that it really helps the kids to improve over time in their space, in their time, in their way. And then the entire group does better together as a result of that. Audiation is a great technique. I think some of the things I've written may lead people to think I would never ever audiate with my students. No, I actually do, but I think it is something that we need to do later. We do it after they've gotten all of those skill sets in. And with my 8th graders, they're really good at all of the sight singing. That's when I begin the audiation because they've built all the skill sets. Those are ingrained and they can listen. They can really hear. Like I think I saw too many of my students when I used to try audiation in the early days with great failure. They would just sit there like, what are we supposed to do? Like they were doing nothing because they didn't know what to do. They had no idea because I teach true beginners. So they just sat there and there was nothing productive. And then when it was time to sing out loud, they were just so scared and frustrated and wrong, And this way, they're taught during chaos, like during the times that we use it, they can hear their mistakes, they can self-assess, they can self-correct, and I encourage that all the time. And I'll talk to them as they're doing chaos. I'm like, I hear a mistake on fa, and to help them learn what maybe they're not doing right. I'm guiding them, but over time I guide them less and less and less. It's like I'm taking the training wheels off, so they can do their own thing. Chaos, I think, is really great for people to, just sing out loud in their environment before we begin the audiation process, which is also going to help them be just better musicians over time. In our country, there are some states in their adjudication process that I've described in Georgia, where students are not allowed to sing out loud. They have to audiate the entire time. And that's what I've written on my blog some, is in response to that. I think that's really not a great situation for kids. I think it causes frustration for teachers. I think in some level it causes teachers to stop attending those events, which I think impacts the kids because they're so frustrated that they don't understand how to get the skill sets into the kids. And that's never a good thing. We want kids to sing.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful, and I love the name. Was it you who gave it that name, or is this a general?
I did that.
It's fantastic.
Each concept as memorable as I could in the process. I wasn't always successful, but that one is something that even if you're not using my program and you're a choir teacher and you're just looking for something to use in your class, you can learn. You could use it and enjoy whatever is on the YouTube channel and figure out how it can work for you.
Yeah, well, it's just so liberating, and I think that's so often what's needed. I think partly why it brought me such joy to see your videos demonstrating this was that, I alluded to my own choir experience. When we were handed a fresh piece of sheet music, there would be 60 seconds where, there'd be some kind of timid humming from some people and other people would be muttering about intervals, and I would literally just be stood there waiting until we sung it the first time, and then I'd be able to sing it. And I remember thinking, do you know what? If you just gave me 5 minutes alone in a room, I could probably figure out how this is meant to sound, but I'm not going to do that out loud in this silent room.
I know.
Your idea of chaos and encouraging everyone to experiment out loud is the exact opposite of that, and so empowering, I think.
Yeah. It's so good for them, and it's so good for them to learn to block out things. I make jokes about it. I'm like, how you block out your mother when she says clean your room, but if she says you're going to get an iPhone 10, you listen, right? So you can do the same thing. You can choose at this moment to block out, right? So we try to make it as fun and funny and silly so that the point is driven, and then they really do work to try to block it out and do their own thing. And then it just becomes part of what they do. And that's another skill set that's going to serve them, even if they don't sing. There's got to be something about what they're taught in those moments that serves them in some other way in their life. I'm sure of it, because it takes so much brain power to do those things.
Absolutely. So I think we've given people a sense of the spirit of S Cubed and your teaching approach, as well as some of the specific tools and techniques you use. But I'd love if you could just talk a bit more about the S Cubed program, what it is, how it works, who it's for.
Okay. Well, I honestly, when I built it, I built it for teachers in my state of Georgia to help them with their adjudication process. That's what it was for originally. It's available on Teachers Pay Teachers, and so teachers around the world have found it over time, and they have found it really useful, which is awesome. It has far surpassed anything I ever could have thought would happen. And I'm sure it doesn't work for everyone. Everybody's different, but the people who have used it, it seems like I've had band teachers who've been stuck in the choral classroom who've decided that it works for them. I've had high school teachers, which I built it for middle school, who teach beginners. Upper elementary teachers. It's just a step-by-step program where I handhold. I want it to be like a personal trainer for the teachers. I wanted them to be able to get up that morning, an hour before they're teaching kids, look at the lesson plan, study it really quick, look at the videos, fast forward what was boring, and get the concept, and then go and do their thing, and use what works and throw out what doesn't. I wanted it to be fun. I want the process to be. It's as much philosophy as it is a method. And the philosophy really is that this process needs to be one where we celebrate every single time that they accomplish something. We never ignore it because it's hard what they're doing. And we enjoy interacting with the kids through the game. And then slowly, before you know it, they're singing 3 parts and they can figure out chromatics, things that I don't think I could do even when I finished my master's degree. Some of the things. Now, I understood the theory behind it, which was great for me. But in terms of actually being able to do it, that was a whole different situation for me and many of my peers in the same school. And I went to a great school. I love my school. I got a great music education there. But I think that the things that I kind of thought about were things that I saw happening in my room. I'm like, they don't understand this. For me, it's natural because I played piano. they don't understand that this is a line note versus a space note. They don't see it because it's so small. So maybe I have to make it bigger for now, so then they see it, and then I'll gradually go smaller. I mean, things that nobody else had addressed before for use in a classroom, practical use in a real classroom with real beginners. That's what I wanted this to serve.
Terrific. Well, people can find the S-Cubed program at In the Middle with Mr. D 1, that's the number 1.blogspot.com, and we'll have a direct link to that in the show notes for this episode. And you'll also find there links to Dale's YouTube channel, where all of the videos we've mentioned can be found, as well as his Teachers Pay Teachers store if you're interested in getting the full S-Cubed program, which you can get bit by bit or as an entire end-to-end program. And it's probably been clear from this conversation, but I am just a huge fan of the way you approach what you teach, the way you equip your students for sight singing, which is a skill that intimidates most musicians, including able singers. So I think it's wonderful that you're doing this work to empower other teachers around the world to do the same thing with their students, and I just definitely applaud you for that. Hopefully it's also come across that this is, something that's designed for teachers, but there is a ton of interesting stuff on Dale's website, In the Middle with Mr. D, that can help any musician, and particularly if you're curious about these topics of singing in tune or learning to sight sing yourself. I would love for you to head over to his YouTube channel, watch some of these videos, and be inspired, because if he can get a room full of rowdy middle school students doing the kind of sight singing he does, then there is definitely hope for all of us adults who struggled with it in the past. Big thank you, Dale. It's been such a pleasure talking to you today, and I hope you have every success in your continuing work in this area.
Thank you for this opportunity. It was great talking to you.
The Musicality Podcast is brought to you by Musical U. Learn more at musical-u.com.
So I think whatever experience or interest you might have in singing and sight singing, you will have found some truly interesting nuggets in that conversation. Let's recap. Dale grew up learning piano and singing from early on, and continued focusing on singing through college before beginning his career as a school music teacher. Perhaps surprisingly for someone who's now so expert in sight singing, Dale wasn't someone to whom sight singing came naturally. And in fact, he sort of bluffed his way through his college sight reading requirement by memorizing the required examples in advance. It wasn't until he was thrown into the world of teaching, and in particular the state choir competitions he was entering with his middle school choirs, that he realized how much he needed to study up on how to help his students learn this skill of sight singing. For me, it was fascinating to get a glimpse into that world of choir competitions and the seriously impressive sight reading abilities that are expected of quite young singers. As I said in the episode, the simple examples he mentioned in some states, such as stepwise quarter notes only, are actually already a challenge for most instrument players or even singers. And so the more complex examples that he tackles with his own choirs are really a demonstration of what can be learned when it comes to sight singing, even without, as he put it, having any little Mozarts in his choirs. We talked about the basics of singing, and how he approaches the fact that not everybody shows up for his choirs able to sing in tune. I love his inclusive and encouraging attitude, and he shares the opinion we've had expressed by several singing experts here on the podcast before, which is that everyone can learn to sing, regardless of the natural ability you start with, or any negative experiences you might have had in the past. Even when the practicalities of his school's program require him to reduce the numbers in his choir, he is always keen to find ways to include anyone who has the desire to be part of singing. That even extends to his personal life, where he uses a karaoke machine and perhaps some light refreshments to get his friends feeling comfortable enough to sing. We talked about the need to break singing down step by step and start with the simple building blocks. You don't chuck students right into the deep end of singing songs and then throw your hands up in the air if it doesn't come out right. If he hears that a student is having trouble hitting the right notes, he helps them privately, one-on-one, beginning from their comfortable range and helping them to tune in to the physical sense of matching pitch, what it sounds and feels like to be in tune versus sharp or flat. He also does this in a group setting with a Bullseye game, where he'll begin singing a note in unison with the piano, and then gradually move his pitch up or down, asking the choir members to indicate when they hear it's gone sharp or flat. Again, this helps them internalize that sense of being in tune versus not. We talked about how this isn't a one-and-done skill to learn. The voice and the ears are biological, and that means this skill does need to be kept up over time. That point about helping choir members who are struggling in a private setting is a really important one. He said he never requires his singers to sing a solo if they don't want to, even to audition for his choir. There are opportunities for those who do want to sing solo, but he's never going to put a singer on the spot in front of a room full of people and challenge them to match pitch or sing something in front of everyone. I think a lot more adult choirs around the world would be flooded with new members if they made clear that that was their attitude. If you're in that situation yourself of liking the idea of singing in a choir, but maybe feeling nervous that you'll be put on the spot to sing alone, I hope you'll be encouraged to get in touch with choir directors and simply ask them. Because as Dale's example shows, being put on the spot like that is absolutely not necessary, even if it is quite common. Perhaps you'll find a choir like his that lets you find your way into singing in a gradual, comfortable way. As well as helping beginner singers in general, Dale's real specialty is in sight singing, where he's able to take students in just a few years from the beginning of singing through to sight reading exercises that most singers would struggle a bit with, and on to mixed rhythms, even syncopation, and pitch leaps as large as an octave. Given that sight singing is so often not taught at all, and so either seen as something you should just magically be able to do if you're a singer, or as an advanced skill that you don't really need to worry about, I was keen to ask Dale about how he's able to bring a group of young singers through to such an impressive level of ability. He explained how he uses Kodai hand signs to establish a visual and kinesthetic connection to the notes in the scale. Although he's not a full-on Kodai practitioner, he's found this particular tool helpful for getting students to connect to how each of the notes in the scale sounds. He uses a particular game, Forbidden Pattern, to teach this in a fun way. And although we didn't talk much about it in this conversation, we will have a link in the show notes so that you can see it in action. Dale only links sight singing to the staff a bit later on, and even then he avoids the nitty-gritty of worrying about key signatures. I think that's really smart, and it's an often overlooked aspect of the Kodai hand signs, that they can actually be used to practice sight singing in a way that's independent of written notation, just trying to produce the right pitches for the hand signs you're seeing somebody do. He teaches his students to pulse their hand signs in time with the beat, so that they're physically keeping the beat going, which he says really helps them juggle the pitch and rhythm at the same time, something that can otherwise be quite tricky for beginners. We talked about what he calls chaos, meaning using the time before you try to sight sing a new piece to practice it out loud, rather than expecting people to purely use silent audiation to figure out how they're going to sing it. I'm going to link in the show notes to a particular video where you can watch his middle school choir go from start to finish with a sight singing challenge, demonstrating these hand signs, pulsing, and chaos in action. I love how that label of chaos liberates the students from worrying about making mistakes. And I think that's an attitude and an activity that we can all make use of. If you're trying to sight sing music at home by yourself, it doesn't mean pick up the sheet music and immediately sing it correctly. Give yourself that space to experiment before you try to perform it. This comes back to something else he said about teaching the students to listen as they sing. He said that while it's great to lose yourself in the enjoyment of singing, it's actually essential to remain switched on so that you can self-assess and self-adjust along the way. Dale also uses a program called Music Prodigy to provide his S-cubed exercises in an interactive way that lets students get immediate feedback on their pitch and rhythm accuracy. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Through learning to teach sight singing to his choirs and achieving success in the state competitions, Dale began to see the opportunity to help other teachers apply the same principles and philosophy with their own choirs. He developed this as the S-cubed program for sight singing and makes it available online. It's offered in a really flexible way at affordable prices, so if you are curious to know more, whether as a teacher yourself or purely as a musician who'd like to be able to sight sing, then definitely do check out Dale's Teachers Pay Teachers catalog, which we'll link to in the show notes. I'm sure it came across in the way I talked about my own sight singing experiences growing up that I really see this as a major weak spot in the way singing and choirs are traditionally taught. And I think a lot of singers are missing out on learning to sight read, when, as Dale has demonstrated, it can be taught impressively well with just a few 10 to 15 minute sessions each week. And the same is true of those foundational singing skills of matching pitch and singing in tune. So I love the work Dale is doing and the encouraging and inclusive spirit he brings to his teaching. Check out his website, In the Middle with Mr. D1, that's the number 1, .blogspot.com, which we'll link to in the show notes at musicalitypodcast.com. Or Dale actually said to me, if you Google middle school sight singing, you'll find him. And have fun watching his videos and reading his blog posts with great advice and ideas for teachers and students alike. Thanks for listening to this episode, and I'll see you on the next one.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive